Just after 4 in the morning, Sunday, November the 3rd, 1907. Inside a brand new marble library on 36th Street in Manhattan, some of the most powerful financiers in America have been awake all night. The front doors, by the Morgan Library's own account, have been quietly locked. As the fuller accounts of that night tell it, the key sat in the pocket of their host. He is 70 years old, and he is not a government official. For 2 weeks he has been doing, out of his own head, a job that in the great financial capitals of Europe belonged to national institutions. There is a paper on the table. $25 million. It is not yet signed, and no one has left. You have probably heard this one told as a hero story. Banker saves America. You may have heard it told the other way, as the origin myth of a conspiracy, the panic that let bankers build the Federal Reserve in secret. I've read the record, and I'm going to tell you something more uncomfortable than either version. The rescue was real, and it worked. That is exactly what terrified everyone. Because when the panic ended, the United States had to sit with what it had just watched. The core of the American financial system had been stabilized by one aging man's private coordination, with Treasury money and other institutions' cash pooled under his direction. No law put him there. No law could replace him. And the men who understood that best spent the next 6 years building his replacement, an institution, so that no one would ever have to trust a J.P. Morgan again. This is a countdown. 3 weeks in October and November 1907, and then one last morning in Washington. Before the clock starts, you need to know why the machine was primed to blow, because the panic of 1907 was built, piece by piece, into the design of American banking. America in 1907 had no central bank. The charters of 2 earlier national banks had died in the 1800s in separate constitutional and political fights. What it had instead was the national banking system, and that system had a design flaw you could set your watch by. The money supply could not stretch. Banknotes were tied to government bonds, not to what the economy needed, and every autumn the same squeeze arrived on schedule. Harvest season. Cash drained out of New York to the countryside to move the crops, and for a few weeks every year, the world's fastest-growing economy ran its finances on fumes. Any shock that landed in October landed on a system already gasping. And by 1907, a new kind of institution had grown up precisely in the gaps of that system. The trust companies. They took deposits like banks, they paid better interest than banks, and they did it by holding a fraction of the reserves banks were required to hold. National banks in New York kept 25 cents of ready money for every deposited dollar. A trust company, even after a tightening in 1906, needed 15. Only 5 of those had to be actual cash. In the decade before the panic, trust company assets in New York had grown 244%. The banks had roughly doubled. One more thing about the trusts, and it is the load-bearing fact of this entire story. They were not members of the New York Clearing House, the Bankers Mutual Defense Club. When a member bank stumbled, the club could carry it. A trust company had no automatic backstop of any kind. In good times, that meant freedom. In a run, any rescue would have to be improvised from scratch. A century later, 2 Federal Reserve historians, John Moen and Ellis Tallman, would reach for a comparison you will recognize. The trust companies of 1907, they wrote, were like the shadow banks of 2008. Remember that phrase. This whole story rhymes with one you already know. 2 more pieces, then the clock runs. First, the tinder. 18 months before the panic, San Francisco burned. The economists Carrie Odell and Mark Weidenmeyer traced what happened next. The earthquake of April 1906 destroyed more than 1% of everything America produced in a year. The insurance bills crossed an ocean. London insurers paid out in gold, and gold drained west. The Bank of England defended itself, raised its rate, and, together with the central banks of France and Germany, tightened the London credit on which American finance depended. A real shock with a monetary aftershock, and the aftershock arrived in New York just in time for harvest season. The market had been falling all year. The forest was dry. Second, the man. John Pierpont Morgan, 70 years old, the organizer of U.S. Steel, the billion-dollar colossus. A man self-conscious enough about his diseased bulbous nose, a condition called rhinophyma, that photographs of him were routinely retouched. He had just built himself a private library on 36th Street, a marble Renaissance palazzo finished the year before to hold his manuscripts. He couldn't have known he had built the room where the American financial system would be saved and then put on trial. In London, Paris, and Berlin, the lender of last resort was an institution. In America, in October 1907, it was going to be this one man's judgment, exercised from that one room. The match, when it came, was almost comically small. A speculator named Otto Heinze believed he could corner the stock of a company called United Copper, controlled by his brother Augustus. Monday, October 14th, he buys hard, and the stock jumps from $39 to $52 in a day. Tuesday, he calls in the shares he believes the short sellers must buy back from him at his price, and discovers the one thing a cornerer cannot survive. The shorts had no trouble finding shares elsewhere. He never had the corner. Wednesday, October 16th, United Copper collapses to $10. The brokerage that executed the scheme fails. By Thursday, the exchange has suspended Otto's firm. A Heinze bank in Montana is insolvent, and Augustus Heinze has been forced out of the New York bank he ran. Now, a failed corner ruins the men who tried it. What turned this one into a national emergency was the boardroom web around it. Augustus Heinze and his ally Charles Morse sat on the boards of banks and trusts across New York. In 1907, there was no wall whatsoever between a director's gambles and his depositor's nerves. Every institution that shared so much as a boardroom with these men was now suspect, whatever its books said. By the weekend, the clearinghouse had forced Heinze and Morse out of banking entirely, hoping the amputation would stop the spread. It was already too late, because the infection had reached a name that did not belong to the club. The Knickerbocker Trust was the third largest trust company in New York, and its president, Charles Barney, was a friend of Charles Morse. That association, mostly that association, was the crime. On Monday, October 21st, Barney was forced to resign. The same day, the National Bank of Commerce announced it would no longer clear the Knickerbockers' checks. Understand what that announcement is in a world without deposit insurance. It is a death sentence read aloud. A bank refusing to clear for you is the system telling the public, "We will not stand behind this name." And the Knickerbocker, being a trust, had no clearinghouse of its own to appeal to. Tuesday morning, the depositors came. Not a metaphor, a queue, down the marble hall on Fifth Avenue and out the doors. In under 3 hours, the Knickerbocker paid out $8 million. Shortly after noon, it simply stopped, closed its windows, suspended. Thousands of depositors, frozen. That afternoon came the coldest decision of the whole panic. Morgan had sent a young banker named Benjamin Strong, a man we will meet again, through the Knickerbocker's books overnight. Strong could not establish solvency in the hours available. Morgan refused support, and the Knickerbocker was left to fall. Because there is always a next name. That is what a panic is. The depositors of every other trust in New York had just watched the third largest one lock its doors by lunch. Wednesday, the run chose its next target, the Trust Company of America, a name so unfortunately perfect a novelist would have rejected it. $12 million claimed in a single day, against $64 million in deposits. This one, Morgan's auditors judged sound, so this one, he decided, would be held. Money was scraped together overnight, and the trust opened its doors again in the morning. Holding one besieged fort, however, does not lift a siege. Thursday, October 24th, is the day the panic stopped being about banks and reached the stock exchange. And it is the best documented 2 hours of the whole crisis, so I will give it to you by the clock. Call money, the overnight loans that float every brokerage on the exchange, had touched 70% earlier that week. On Thursday, the rate on offer reached 100, and at moments, even 100% found no takers. The pipe was dry. 1:30. The president of the New York Stock Exchange, Ransom Thomas, walks across the street to Morgan's office and tells him the exchange cannot survive the afternoon. He intends to close it early. Morgan tells him that if the exchange closes 1 minute before its normal hour, the panic wins, and sends for the bank presidents. 2:00. They arrive. 16 minutes later, 14 bank presidents have pledged $23.6 million. By 2:30, the money is on the floor. By the close, $19 million of it is out on loan, and the exchange has lived to ring its own bell. That evening, leaving yet another conference, Morgan gave reporters one of his few on-record remarks of the entire panic. If people will keep their money in the banks, everything will be all right. He was describing, accurately, a faith that no longer existed and would have to be rebuilt by hand, by him, over the next 10 days. He was not alone. That same Thursday, the Treasury moved $25 million of public money into the New York banks. But Treasury support was finite, and Morgan's real power was the thing no statute provided: the ability to summon other men's balance sheets into a room and commit them. Restate the position. 10 days in. The Knickerbocker dead. One fort held by hand. The exchange saved by a whip round with 16 minutes to spare. And underneath all of it, the real disease. Cash itself was going into hiding, in vaults, in mattresses all over the continent, and the system had no mechanism fast enough to make more. So the system made some anyway. On Saturday, October 26th, the New York Clearinghouse began issuing loan certificates, private scrip that member banks could pass between themselves in place of the cash they were hoarding. It was improvised money, secured by collateral the club accepted from its own members, but standing entirely outside the country's ordinary statutory currency. Sprague's official post-mortem for the Senate records that New York alone issued $101 million of it. Cities across the country followed, until private substitutes were doing the work of a national currency. Across the country, the certificates alone came to some $238 million, and counting every kind of emergency scrip, close to $500 million. In 70-odd cities, America spent that winter paying for groceries, in part, with money that money printers had not printed. I find this the most quietly damning fact of the whole episode. The country's bankers, faced with a system that could not stretched it themselves, outside the ordinary law of the currency, and everyone applauded, because the alternative was collapse. A nation was discovering, in real time, what a central bank is for, by being forced to improvise a bad one out of club rules. And the emergencies kept coming. Before October was out, the city of New York itself came to Morgan's library, needing $30 million by month's end to avoid default. It got the money from a syndicate Morgan assembled around his own firm. Added to the list: bank runs, the stock exchange, now the city government. Every road in American finance that month ran through one address on 36th Street. Which brings us back to the library, and the night this story was always driving toward. The last domino was a brokerage called Moore & Schley, deep in debt, its loans propped on the stock of the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. If the banks called those loans Monday morning, The firm's collapse would restart the whole panic with the system already exhausted. Morgan's answer had two moving parts, and he ran them simultaneously in two rooms of his library through Saturday night. In one room, the plan for Moore and Schley. U.S. Steel, his own creation, would buy Tennessee coal outright, swapping shaky collateral for solid steel paper. In the other room sat the trust company presidents, the men whose institutions were still bleeding. From them he wanted $25 million to fortify the weakest trusts so there would be nothing left to run on. The trust men balked. They had spent 2 weeks watching each other bleed, and every one of them wanted to keep his cash for his own doors. Around midnight, Morgan named the number. Around 3 in the morning, he was still pressing. And at some point in those small hours, as the accounts of the night tell it, the presidents discovered the doors were locked, and the key was in Morgan's pocket. He was 70 years old, and he had simply decided that the American financial system was not leaving his library until it agreed to save itself. Just after 4 on Sunday morning, the pledge was in hand. The leader of the trust presidents signed. The rest followed. I want to be precise about what happened in that room, because it is the hinge of the era. No law compelled those signatures. No official presided. The resolution of a national emergency was secured under extraordinary private pressure, by one citizen's force of will. It worked. And a democracy cannot run on it working. One signature was still missing, and it was the president's. U.S. Steel buying Tennessee coal was, on its face, exactly the kind of monopoly-swallowing competitor deal Theodore Roosevelt had built his presidency breaking. So late on Sunday night, 2 steelmen, Elbert Gary and Henry Clay Frick, boarded an overnight train to Washington to ask the great trustbuster whether his administration would stand in the way. They reached the White House with the market about to open. Roosevelt, interrupting breakfast, heard the case. Acquiesce, or the panic reignites at 10 o'clock. He declined to object before the bell. In his autobiography, he put it plainly, "It was necessary for me to decide on the instant before the stock exchange opened, for the situation in New York was such that any hour might be vital." The news hit the wires, the market breathed, and the immediate threat of collapse receded. The wider crisis did not end that morning. Cash stayed scarce for weeks. The economy shrank hard through the following year, with industrial output falling by double digits before it turned. On November 14th, Charles Barney of the Knickerbocker, disgraced and shut out, died by his own hand at his home. The record does not let us reduce that death to a single cause, and I will not try. His trust, in the end, did not even fail. It reopened the following spring and paid its depositors in full, with interest. The people who queued in October were locked out for roughly 5 months. Barney did not live to see it. And here is the coda history usually skips. The rescue had a receipt. The acquisition later drew congressional scrutiny, and that inquiry disputed parts of the emergency case that had been presented to Roosevelt in real time. The surviving record does not reduce the transaction to pure rescue, and it does not reduce it to simple opportunism. The savior of the system had, in the same weekend, acquired for his own company a prize it could hardly have taken in calmer times. Both things are true. Hold both. Because the men who ran the country had also watched that weekend and drawn the obvious conclusion. Morgan was 70. Next time there might be no Morgan. The lender of last resort of the United States was one mortal man with no successor, and that is not a system, it is a lucky streak. The reform took 6 years, and its path runs straight through the panic's embers. 1908, an emergency currency law legalizing next time what the clearinghouses had improvised, and chartering a national monetary commission to study what a real fix would look like. 1910, the strangest episode in American financial history. The commission's chairman, Senator Nelson Aldrich, traveled with 5 other men, bankers and government advisors, in a private rail car under first names only, to a hunting club on Jekyll Island, Georgia. There they drafted a central bank plan in secret. The secrecy itself is documented, confessed in print by one of the participants, who called himself as furtive as any conspirator. But here is the part the conspiracy books reliably leave out, and the part their critics overcorrect. The Jekyll Island plan failed politically. Introduced as the Aldrich Plan, banker-run by design, it was dead on arrival in a Congress that would not hand bankers the keys in public. Yet its technical machinery did not vanish. Pooled reserves, an elastic currency, rediscounting. Those ideas survived into the law that passed in December 1913. What changed, decisively, was who governed the machine. A board appointed by the president, regional reserve banks, currency that was an obligation of the United States. The bankers' draft lost the fight over control, and much of its engineering won anyway. That mixed inheritance is the honest version. Morgan himself testified before Congress in December 1912, when the money trust investigation counted up his firm's reach. The partners and officers of his syndicate held 341 directorships across 112 corporations, holding $22 billion in combined resources. Asked whether credit rested on money, the old man gave the answer he is still quoted on. The first thing is character, before money or anything else. 3 months later, he was dead, in his sleep, in Rome. 267 days after that, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act. The man who had been the American Central Bank did not live to see the institution built to replace him. And its first commander in New York, where the fires start, was Benjamin Strong, the same young banker who had gone through the Knickerbocker's books in October 1907. The panic trained its own successor. So, the ledger as the record leaves it. The hero version is half true. Morgan organized the defense, and the defense held, and the Treasury's millions and other men's money were under it, holding too. The conspiracy version fares worse. The panic's immediate trigger was a failed copper corner, not financiers scheming for a central bank. The secret banker draft that followed lost its fight in Congress, even as its engineering survived under new management. And what the record does not show matters as much. It does not show that Morgan caused the panic. It does not show that one locked door by itself created the Federal Reserve. What is fully true is the uncomfortable middle. The system was saved by concentrated private power, and the rescue enriched the rescuer. The country, having seen both halves clearly, decided it would never again depend on the character of one man, whatever his character was. 101 years later, in 2008, the crisis came back wearing new clothes. Money market funds and investment banks stood where the trust companies had stood, outside the safety net, lightly reserved, first to be run on. That is not my parallel. Ben Bernanke, running the Federal Reserve through it, said the panic of 1907 and the panic of 2008 were instances of the same phenomenon. The institution built to replace Morgan spent that autumn doing, at continental scale, what Morgan did with a locked door. The machine changes, the run does not. The Panic Papers is me reading the receipts so you can check them. The source list is in the description. Here is what I keep circling back to. The people who stood in line at the Knickerbocker got everything back 5 months late, and we remember the man with the key. Tell me in the comments which half of that you find more remarkable. Honestly, I go back and forth. Subscribe for the next file. And if you want the century's other locked room decision about money, the weekend Nixon closed the gold window is already on the channel.